Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into something so oddly familiar and yet absurdly out of place: Victorian New Year's resolutions. These were promises that could only have been made by people who thought bathing in freezing water for health was a good idea, and eating a proper dinner required 13 courses. That's right, we're talking about the year 1885, when people were resolving to be better versions of themselves while still riding around in horse-drawn carriages and struggling to open a can of beans with an actual knife. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment below telling me what your most ridiculous New Year's resolution was. Or, if you're more of a let's not pretend to change type, let me know that too. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soothing white noise, get cozy, and maybe make sure you're not wearing tight corsets or top hats, because we've got some serious 19th century awkwardness to dive into. Let's take a second to think. Have you ever resolved to be healthier, wealthier, or simply more pleasant to be around, only to fall face first into a pint of ice cream by January 5th? Ever wondered if people in the 1800s had the same idea of self-improvement as we do today, or if their goals were much, much stranger? Did they ever get to fulfill those resolutions, or did they get distracted by the thrill of a good old-fashioned horse race, or let's face it, the prospect of a serious snowstorm? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in Victorian England. The year is 1885, and you're about to resolve to be the most ridiculously well-behaved person in the land, all while surrounded by gas lamps and enough velvet to make your head spin. Welcome to your new life, sort of. Imagine a time when health resolutions involved rubbing your body with freezing water and thinking it was a good idea. How did these people convince themselves that chilling their bodies to the bone would somehow lead to a longer life? The best part: they didn't have air conditioning, so the therapy wasn't exactly optional. It was everywhere. It wasn't just a fad either. It was a full-blown movement, spearheaded by medical experts who were absolutely certain that freezing your skin off would somehow make you stronger. This wasn't the relaxing spa treatment you might imagine today. No. This was full-on ice-cold water, 19th century style. Now let's set the scene. You're living in Victorian England, where the best way to tone up isn't by going to a gym. Because let's face it, gyms hadn't been invented yet, but by stepping into a frosty cold bath or braving the chilling winds of winter without so much as a blanket to hug. This wasn't just a health practice, this was a lifestyle. Cold water cures everything, the pamphlets said, which in retrospect is a slogan that should have come with a warning. Results may vary. Side effects include frostbite, hypothermia, and possibly a cold for the rest of your life. But don't think it ended with ice baths. Oh no, Victorian health fanatics were into all sorts of odd remedies for their health resolutions. They were the original detox crowd, convinced that daily cold plunges, frequent leeching, yes, leeching, and even consuming mysterious herbal concoctions would cleanse them of impurities. The thing is, they had no real idea what impurities even were. What was it that needed to be removed from their bodies? Perhaps a bit of common sense. So there you are, wrapped in a wooden blanket, which of course was probably riddled with moths, staring at a giant tub of ice-cold water. It's not an option. It's a resolution. The thought of improving your health by submerging yourself in near-freezing temperatures somehow seemed reasonable when the only alternative was spending the rest of your life with bad humors. You know, those invisible evil forces that were thought to reside in your body and cause everything from a bad mood to full-on illness. So as logic would have it, freezing them out seemed like a solid solution. Picture this. You're standing by your icy cold bath, hesitating for just a moment, trying to mentally prepare for a literal chill to the bone. You can almost hear your muscles scream in terror, and yet you step in anyway, plunging yourself into the freezing water. It's supposed to be good for your blood circulation, supposedly, but by the time you've gotten fully submerged, all you really know is that you can no longer feel your toes, and your entire body is screaming for mercy. But hey, at least you're not getting the flu, right? Except for that horrible, wet, freezing cold sensation that sticks with you all day. But sure, you'll be healthier in the long run, probably. Now, let's move on to the bizarre world of Victorian food practices. With all this talk of cold water and health, it's hard to ignore the fact that these same health-conscious Victorians were also gorging themselves on massive meals, often involving not just one, but several courses of meat, sauces, and desserts. It was as though the resolution to eat clean was immediately followed by an impulse to gorge on everything in sight. Could it be that these people truly thought they could freeze their way into a healthier body while simultaneously filling it with rich gravy and roasted meats? Well, they certainly tried. After all, it wasn't about moderation, it was about extremes. But wait, there's more. Not only did Victorians subject themselves to freezing cold water and overindulgent feasts, but they also believed that sitting around for hours wrapped in bandages, holding tightly onto a steel rod to correct their posture, would somehow make them live longer. This wasn't just for show either. There were real, actual people standing there in their full Victorian getup, practically locking themselves in a standing position for hours, just to make sure their spine was in perfect alignment. It was as if the idea of sitting comfortably was beneath them. Posture first, comfort second seemed to be their motto. If they had had time for mottos between their busy health improvement sessions. You may be wondering, did any of this actually work? Did the ice baths, the endless hours of correct posture, and the strange concoctions they drank make a difference? It's hard to say, because if you ask any Victorian, they'd probably tell you it was just what one did. But in hindsight, it's possible that all these so-called health practices did was make them really, really cold and extremely tired. Maybe their best resolution was simply to survive all the discomforts they willingly put themselves through. But here's the kicker. They did survive. Somehow, these resolute people managed to keep going year after year, despite the freezing baths, the questionable diets, and the hours spent trying to stand up straight, like a human statue. It was almost as if the resilience of the human spirit could survive anything, even a self-imposed regimen that could only be described as torture in the name of health. So next time you're struggling to stick to a New Year's resolution, just remember that at least you're not rubbing your body with ice-cold water or standing awkwardly for hours on end, waiting for your spine to snap into place. And who knows? Maybe the Victorians' worst health resolution wasn't about what they did, but what they thought they could endure. Maybe their real resolution was simply to outlast the absurdity of it all. Let's talk about food. In the Victorian era, a proper meal could include up to 13 courses. That's not a typo. 13. By the time you're done eating, you've probably outgrown your New Year's resolution to eat healthier and swapped it for survive until next year. The Victorians took their meals seriously, so seriously, in fact, that they believed the more food they consumed, the more refined and civilized they were. Forget about portion control, balanced diets, or even the possibility of actually enjoying your food. This was all about showing off how much you could consume in a single sitting. Now imagine yourself seated at a grand dining table in a Victorian mansion. The air smells of roasted meats, rich sauces, and a symphony of freshly baked bread. Your stomach starts to churn with anticipation, but also a little dread, because you know this meal is going to take a while. The first course arrives, soup. Simple, right? But not just any soup. It's a rich, creamy concoction, perhaps a lobster bisque or a thick, indulgent consomme that makes you wonder if you've been transported to a Michelin star restaurant. Except, of course, without the restraint of modern-day decorum. You're already thinking, how in the world am I going to finish this? By course 2, you're already starting to second-guess your decision to attend this dinner. Here comes the fish course. It's not just a piece of salmon either. No, this is a full presentation, a beautifully plated fish surrounded by decorative garnishes, perhaps even a small side of oysters or mussels. You're trying to pace yourself, but it's impossible. You've barely finished the soup when the third course arrives. Roast meats, veal, lamb, and maybe a side of duck, all swimming in rich gravies. It's enough to make your head spin, and yet the host looks at you with such sincerity, as though they've just handed you a treasure trove. The fourth course might be something light, like a palate-cleansing sorbet, but by now, you're regretting that first bite of soup. You've been eating for what feels like hours, and you're starting to contemplate your life choices. But you can't back out now. You're a guest, and these Victorians did not appreciate leaving food unfinished. Oh no, that would be a grave insult. You force a smile, because it's all about good manners now, right? And that's when you spot it. A towering roast boar coming out of the kitchen, followed by a platter of delicate pastries that might as well have been sculpted from sugar and butter. You could probably use a nap at this point, but who has time for rest when you've got 9 more courses to go? Let's pause for a second. Ever thought about how many times someone had to get up and refill their glass of wine? Because, oh yes, each course was paired with a fine wine, perhaps a Burgundy, a Bordeaux, or even a rich port, making you question whether it was more of a drinking contest than a meal. And then there's the dessert course, which can only be described as a dizzying parade of pastries, cakes, fruit tarts, and maybe even an entire pie for yourself. Yes, you read that correctly, a whole pie. By the end of this 13-course meal, you'd probably need a second stomach just to deal with the aftermath. As you push back from the table, clutching your stomach, you realize something profound. Victorian meals weren't just about food, they were about the experience, the performance, and most importantly, the display of wealth and status. It wasn't enough to eat. You had to eat with flair. The more you ate, the more you were admired by your peers. You were proving to everyone at that table that you could handle the excess, that you could gorge yourself in the name of sophistication, and that you could not, be defeated by the ridiculous abundance that had just been placed before you. Now imagine making a resolution to eat healthier in the midst of all this. It's almost laughable, isn't it? You've just consumed an entire farm's worth of food in the span of a few hours, and now you're supposed to go home and eat a salad the next day. You might as well try to run a marathon the day after completing a 10-course dessert buffet. But that was the reality in the Victorian age. Gluttony as a form of social currency, where eating more than your guests was a sure way to win their admiration. And just when you think you've reached the end, the final course arrives, a final sweet or a delicate digest if to cleanse the palate. A small glass of something strong enough to put the entire dining party into a state of blissful lethargy. This was not just eating, it was an event, a show, and at the end of the day, a challenge of survival. If you left that table still standing and with the ability to walk, well, you'd achieved something remarkable. And as you finally say your goodbyes, trying to stand without waddling, you can't help but think, maybe next year I'll resolve to eat fewer courses. But then again, you're Victorian, and resolutions are meant to be broken anyway. It's 1885, and instead of buying gym memberships or watching motivational TikToks, Victorians were more likely to book a trip to some remote corner of the world to find themselves. But did they ever really improve themselves, or did they just get incredibly sunburned in exotic locales? In a time when self-improvement was a serious business, the Victorians believed that the key to a better life wasn't found in a books or through some calming breathwork session, but in the form of a lengthy, expensive voyage. The journey was the reward, or so they thought. Their version of finding themselves was less about reflecting quietly and more about clinging to a map, hoping they didn't get eaten by a lion along the way. Now let's picture this scene. You, in your perfectly tailored Victorian suit or lavish dress, board a steamship bound for somewhere you can barely pronounce. Perhaps the jungles of Africa or the snowy peaks of the Himalayas. It's not about relaxation, mind you. It's about personal growth. You're not just a tourist, you're a pilgrim, searching for something greater. But there's a catch. What exactly are you searching for? Perhaps wisdom? Enlightenment? Or are you just trying to avoid the unbearable awkwardness of having too much free time back home, where your biggest adventure might be surviving a dinner with your in-laws? Victorian adventurers weren't just on holiday. They were engaged in what could only be described as extreme tourism. Let's take the explorers of Africa, for example. These weren't your Instagram influences, posting picturesque sunsets. No, they were battling mosquitoes, wild animals, and possibly a terrifying lack of indoor plumbing, all in the name of self-discovery. And when they returned, what did they have to show for it? A collection of animal hides, some questionable souvenirs, and a healthy dose of dysentery. It's like the Victorian version of backpacking, except the backpacks were stuffed with malaria tablets and a very real fear of being eaten alive. Then, there were those who ventured into the icy reaches of the Arctic. Picture this. You're aboard a ship braving endless stretches of ice, desperately trying to find a route to the North Pole, convinced that if you just pushed a little farther, you'd uncover the secret to eternal life. Instead, you'd likely find yourself buried in snow, freezing to death, your only companions a group of equally deluded explorers. This wasn't exactly the spiritual awakening one might have imagined in modern times. No, this was more like a history lesson in how to overestimate your abilities to survive on a diet of canned food and frostbite. But it wasn't just about surviving the elements. It was about surviving your own absurd expectations. Victorians had a strange need to find meaning in everything. A walk through the Swiss Alps wasn't just a walk, it was an existential quest. Finding the perfect mountaintop view, that wasn't just scenic beauty, that was a metaphor for the peak of human potential. And when you returned to England with stories of your triumphs, people would listen, in awe as you recounted your near-death experiences, because, of course, nothing says, "I've grown as a person," like almost dying in a remote part of the world. This wasn't just a thing for the aristocracy either. Even the middle class got in on the action, except they were more likely to travel to a quaint town in the English countryside, hoping that a nice walk through nature would somehow lead to the same enlightenment as trekking across the savannah. And while the Victorians were busy discovering the unknown, they were also obliviously ignoring the unknown right in their own backyards. What could be more self-improvement focused than exploring the local library, or even just taking a walk through your own city to observe the overlooked beauty of the familiar? But no, instead, they had to venture across the globe to find themselves, often just to find the nearest mosquito. And let's not forget the spiritual elements of travel. There was a very real fascination with places that could deliver some sort of transcendental experience. India, with its spiritual mysticism and promise of enlightenment, was a particularly popular destination. But despite their best efforts to commune with the gods and unlock the secrets of the universe, what often happened was they just got seriously ill from the food or tangled in a web of miscommunications. Still, they pressed on, convinced that a true Victorian adventurer was never truly lost, just temporarily reoriented. But here's the kicker. Did any of these so-called adventures actually lead to meaningful self-improvement, or did it just give them excellent stories to tell at their next dinner party? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Did they gain profound wisdom? Maybe, but probably not the type they expected. What they really got was a whole lot of discomfort, a few souvenirs, and perhaps a newfound appreciation for the comforts of home, like a proper bed and not needing to worry about the next wild animal attack. Ultimately, the Victorians returned home not as enlightened philosophers, but as people who had learned that maybe, just maybe, there were easier ways to work on yourself than trekking through jungles and braving glaciers. The Victorians took resolutions to the next level with a focus on becoming morally perfect. Want to be more virtuous in the new year? Just follow the 37 rules of proper behavior, including never, under any circumstances, making an unsolicited joke. That's right, no jokes in the Victorian world, ever. The idea of moral improvement wasn't just about quitting bad habits or being a little kinder to others. No. It was about transforming yourself into a walking embodiment of proneness, decency, and, let's be honest, complete and utter repression. This was a time when even your facial expressions were heavily regulated by the never-ending list of rules on how to be a respectable member of society. Forget self-love, forget therapy. This was a year of self-denial. Picture this. It's January 1st, and you've just made the decision to be a better person. You grab your Victorian moral handbook, which has 37 bullet points that cover everything from the way you sit to the tone of voice you use when speaking to others. The first rule: do not laugh at anything unless it is a deeply serious matter. Seriously, if something was funny, it had to be a joke about something important, like the weather or the inconvenience of bad plumbing. Anything else? A tragedy, plain and simple. Of course, this leads to a lot of uncomfortable social interactions where you smile politely at jokes, but you're not allowed to laugh. Humor is a serious thing, don't you know? They'd say with all the gravitas of a person who hadn't experienced a single spontaneous moment of joy in years. And then there's the walking part, specifically the way you walked. The Victorians were obsessed with posture. Apparently, how you carried yourself said everything about your moral character. Slouching was a clear indication that you were lazy and morally deficient. So what did that mean for New Year's resolutions? You had to walk with military precision, back, straight, head high, shoulders back. The best way to avoid accusations of being a lazy, immoral person was to walk as if you had a broomstick lodged up your spine. The only thing more uncomfortable than the self-improvement regimen was trying to get through the day without constantly worrying about whether or not your posture was betraying you. And don't even get started on clothing. Victorian fashion wasn't just about what was stylish. It was about adhering to the rigid expectations of decency. A lady's dress couldn't be too short, and a gentleman's trousers couldn't be too tight, lest anyone suspect he was not, in fact, a perfectly moral and upstanding citizen. In fact, certain colors were considered immoral. Imagine trying to decide what to wear and realizing that your favorite shade of red was deemed too daring for someone trying to follow the rules of decency. You simply cannot wear that, they would say. It's far too flamboyant. It suggests you're not above reproach. You could easily spend more time fretting over what color dress to wear than deciding on what charity to donate to. Your moral standing was under constant scrutiny. Now let's talk about the big one, relationships. Victorian moralism demanded perfection in all aspects of human interaction, especially when it came to romance and friendship. It wasn't enough to be a good person. You had to constantly prove your virtue. Flirting, unacceptable. Speaking to someone of the opposite sex, only if it was absolutely necessary, and only in the most decorous manner. Imagine making a New Year's resolution to be more socially outgoing, only to be told that talking to someone of the opposite sex was something you did with the utmost formality and rigidity. Why don't you try discussing the weather? Was the Victorian version of let's go grab coffee sometime. These people weren't even allowed the pleasure of a casual hello. And what about your daily routine? Well, moral self-improvement also meant that you should spend most of your day in service to others. Leisure time was considered morally dangerous, so if you were a Victorian striving to follow the moral rules, you were likely spending hours volunteering for charitable organizations or attending religious services. You might imagine that their New Year's resolution was something simple, like taking more time for self-care, but in the Victorian world, self-care was frowned upon. You weren't supposed to be thinking about yourself. You were supposed to be focusing on others every waking hour of the day, not because it would make you feel good, but because it was morally right. You didn't relax. You didn't treat yourself or engage in idle chatter. Instead, you engaged in self-sacrifice in the hopes of becoming a morally upstanding member of society. Now let's take a moment to consider the reality of all this. What happens when people try so hard to adhere to a system of moral perfection? They end up exhausted, anxious, and probably a little bitter about how much they're holding back. They can't enjoy a good laugh. They can't wear what they want. They can't flirt or even have a casual conversation. Their lives become one long list of what not to do's. That New Year's resolution to be morally perfect often leads not to enlightenment, but to sheer social misery. So by the time January 1st rolls around next year, you're likely still stuck somewhere between trying to adhere to the 37 rules and quietly wondering if maybe the best resolution would simply be to relax, eat some cake, and not worry so much about whether you've laughed at the wrong joke. Because in the end, These rigid resolutions might have made people appear morally perfect, but they certainly didn't leave much room for actual living. Let's talk about fashion. You thought the modern obsession with fitness was tough? Try wearing a corset so tight that you can barely breathe while also resolving to attend the 12's formal dinners in a week. It's the original New Year, New Me, except with more silk and a lot less breathing room. Victorian fashion wasn't just about looking good, it was about suffocating yourself for the sake of elegance. Seriously, the idea of squeezing yourself into a corset that could double as a medieval torture device and calling it self-improvement is, well, absurd. But that's exactly what Victorians did every year. They made resolutions to wear more refined clothing, leading to an era where people were essentially living mannequins, stiff, unyielding, and perpetually a little lightheaded. Picture it. New Year's Day arrives, and your resolution for the year is to look as refined and statuesque as possible. But how do you achieve this? By squeezing yourself into layers upon layers of fabric, of course. The corset is the pièce de résistance of Victorian fashion, and it's meant to create the ideal hourglass shape. The idea of breathing freely was, well, optional. For those of you who've never had the pleasure of wearing a corset, let's just say that it's less like slipping on a dress and more like stepping into a high-pressure situation. Literally. Your waist is cinched so tightly that you can barely move, and each breath you take feels like you're deflating a balloon. And for the Victorians, that was the point. The tighter, the better. After all, a small waist was the ultimate sign of both beauty and restraint. It's the fashion equivalent of trying to run a marathon while being told to hold your breath the entire time. Now imagine having to attend a formal dinner in one of these contraptions. It's not like you can just sit back and enjoy your meal. No, you're sitting upright, shoulders back, and every bite feels like a small victory. A corset-wearing woman could be spotted at every social gathering, perched stiffly in her chair, attempting to navigate the cumbersome nature of her dress and the even more cumbersome expectations that came with it. After a few hours of this, your New Year's resolution to be graceful turns into an internal debate about whether you'll make it through the night without passing out from a lack of oxygen. And let's not forget the layers. Oh, the layers. A Victorian woman didn't just throw on a dress and go about her day. No, she had to assemble an entire ensemble, petticoats, layers of fabric, and of course the corset, all in the name of modesty and grace. The amount of fabric involved was so excessive that it practically created its own gravitational pull. By the time you were fully dressed, you felt less like a person and more like an overstuffed dumpling, barely able to move. And if you thought you were finished with the corset after dinner, think again. After the meal, you'd probably need to go to bed in the same restrictive outfit, as corsets were part of the Victorian version of comfort. But it wasn't just women who had fashion resolutions. Men, too, had their own sartorial constraints. While their outfits were a little less physically punishing, the idea of dressing for success was alive and well. Men were expected to wear tailored suits that fit just perfectly, making them look both dashing and, well, a bit like they were stuffed into an overly starched cardboard box. And let's not even talk about top hats, the height, the brim, the sheer formality of it all. Men, too, resolved to present themselves as the epitome of refinement and control. But unlike women's outfits, which were basically armor, men's fashion was more about projecting a carefully calculated image of wealth and success. But much like the women, they too had to navigate dinner parties, balls, and social gatherings while hoping they didn't sweat through their perfectly pressed trousers or pass out from the heat trapped beneath their layers. In fact, the most uncomfortable part of this whole fashion craze wasn't even the corsets or the formal dinners. No, it was the constant pressure to maintain appearances. Victorian fashion was all about creating a controlled, respectable image. But underneath those layers of fabric, people were sweating, squirming, and barely holding it all together. The resolution to be more fashionable in the Victorian era came with a heavy price. A price that was paid not in money, but in sheer, unrelenting discomfort. So next time you make a New Year's resolution to get in better shape or dress more stylishly, remember the Victorians, who essentially decided that breathing was optional. They resolved to look elegant, proper, and moral, but they also set the bar so high that there was no room left to, actually enjoy life. And while we may not be strapping ourselves into corsets anytime soon, we can still admire the Victorian dedication to style and refinement, while being very grateful for modern-day elastic waistbands and the ability to breathe freely at dinner. The Victorians were obsessed with being productive, but their idea of a productive day often involved a 5-hour meeting, followed by a 2-hour lunch break, and then a nap. Maybe that's why they never got much done, but at least they looked very productive in the process. If you've ever struggled to balance ambition with actual results, just wait until you hear about the Victorian workday. You see, these were the people who thought that the more time you spent looking busy, the more you were actually getting done. The fact that their working hours often included several moments of leisure, like the afternoon tea break or a brief stroll in the garden, was of course considered a sign of high culture and good management. But when it came to getting actual work done, not so much. Imagine it. You've set your Victorian work resolution. This year, you're going to be more productive, work smarter, and climb the ladder of success. So you wake up early. Not too early, of course. Victorians didn't believe in rushing. Put on your finest outfit and head off to the office. You sit down at your desk, feeling good about the future, your resolution at the ready. But hold on. Before you can even open your first letter, you're summoned to a meeting. A 5-hour meeting. Yes, 5 hours. This wasn't an occasional affair either. No, Victorians were serious about their meetings. It didn't matter if they discussed the same things for hours, or if no real decisions were made. What mattered was that they spent the time looking like they were engaged in something important. In reality, these meetings often became a hodgepodge of unfocused chatter and constant references to rules and regulations. But as you can guess, after this productive 5-hour discussion, it was time for a break. 2 whole hours for lunch. Oh yes, lunch in the Victorian era was an event. It wasn't about grabbing a sandwich and rushing back to work. No, lunch could take hours, especially if you were partaking in a lavish affair that involved a meal fit for royalty. Sure, you could have used those 2 hours to tackle your never-ending to-do list, but that wasn't how it worked in Victorian society. Taking the time to enjoy lunch was part of the social fabric of the time. Not only did you eat, but you also engaged in animated conversations and pleasantries. After all, one can't work without ensuring that proper etiquette is observed, right? And why hurry? You had plenty of time. But wait, it's not over yet. After your hearty meal and jovial socializing, it's time for the nap. Yes, napping was built into the Victorian workday. And no, this wasn't a quick power nap. This was a scheduled rest period. Maybe it's not such a bad idea. An afternoon snooze in the middle of a busy day does sound kind of luxurious. But here's the catch. While you're napping or having a second breakfast, and possibly a third, your pile of work continues to grow. Bills to pay, letters to send, projects to complete. They all wait for you patiently, like the looming storm of responsibility. The Victorian idea of productivity was focused entirely on appearances. If you were seen at the right places, in the right meetings, wearing the right clothes, you were considered productive. Getting things done, however, was entirely secondary to making sure you were maintaining the image of a hardworking person. And let's not forget the evening hour, which was the time to unwind from your extremely productive day. Of course, this unwinding usually involved attending a lavish dinner party or engaging in another round of conversation with the people you had already seen for hours at lunch. Dinner parties were as much about networking as they were about eating, and conversations were as much about showing off your conversational skills as they were about any meaningful exchange of ideas. Could you use this time to knock out a few tasks on your to-do list? Possibly. But instead, you're likely seated in a plush chair, talking about the weather or the latest scandal in society. Now let's talk about what was actually getting done during all of this. The reality is not much. Victorian productivity wasn't about checking off tasks from a list or advancing a project. It was about doing just enough to appear busy without actually accomplishing anything of substance. If you were an office worker, you might spend hours filing paperwork, simply rearranging it to make it look like progress was being made. If you were in a more creative profession, well, you might spend your day pondering ideas without ever committing to a single one. This was the work culture of the time, a perpetual cycle of looking busy while secretly wishing the clock would hurry up and hit 5 p.m. so you could go home, put your feet up, and forget about your resolutions entirely. So what happened when the year ended? Well, the Victorians probably concluded that they had been productive, but if they were being honest, they didn't achieve much of their goals. Their resolutions had been about appearing productive, but they hadn't been about real achievement. They'd perfected the art of filling time with meetings, lunch breaks, and naps, but by the end of the year, they had little to show for it. And so, the cycle would begin again. New Year's resolutions to work harder, more efficiently, and more meaningfully, only to fall into the same pattern of productivity, masquerading as productivity. But at least they looked good doing it. Maybe that was the real success after all. Detoxing was all the rage. What did it mean? Usually, it meant an elaborate system of herbal concoctions and fasting designed to cleanse your body of things it didn't even know it had. The fact that these were more likely to make you ill than actually make you healthy didn't seem to bother anyone. In fact, if you were a proper Victorian, you probably felt obligated to try at least one of these health tonics or cleansing rituals as part of your annual self-improvement routine. After all, who wouldn't want to detoxify themselves from whatever mysterious, unseen toxins were lurking inside them? Just thinking about it, this idea of ridding your body of things you didn't even know you were carrying was, in itself, a comforting notion. It was a sign of sophistication, a mark of someone who cared about their health in the most fashionable way possible. Now imagine yourself ready to embark on the ultimate detox experience. You've got your Victorian health guide in hand, and inside you find a recipe for the latest and greatest detox tonic. The ingredients? A delightful mixture of herbs, roots, and various questionable liquids designed to purge your body of humors, those mysterious, invisible forces that were thought to control your health back then. Did you really need this concoction? Probably not. Did it matter? Absolutely not. You were about to cleanse your body in a way that would impress anyone who happened to ask. And besides, what could be wrong with drinking a mysterious potion if everyone around you was doing it too? The tonic might have smelled like rotting plants mixed with a hint of regret, but who cared? You were now part of a tradition that was sure to lead to a healthier, more balanced you. You drink the potion, let's call it the elixir of vitality, and immediately feel the burning sensation as it courses through your system. Now, this is the moment you've been waiting for. Your body is supposed to react with a cleansing rush, expelling toxins that you didn't even know existed. But here's the thing. Instead of feeling refreshed, you begin to feel nauseous, dizzy, and slightly concerned about the fact that your stomach seems to be rejecting whatever it is you've just consumed. But you've read the pamphlets, you know the drill, you push through it. The body must purge itself of impurities, the pamphlet says. The discomfort is a sign that the elixir is working. Of course, the Victorian version of detox didn't come with the modern luxury of a side of ginger tea or a heating pad. You had to grit your teeth and endure the suffering because self-improvement required a bit of misery, right? The whole experience was a cross between an ancient ritual and a science experiment gone horribly wrong. And this wasn't even the worst of it. If the herbal concoctions didn't do the trick, you could always go for the fasting regimen. The Victorians were big on fasting as a form of self-purification. The logic was that by depriving yourself of food, you could reset your body and become the healthiest version of yourself. But of course, in typical Victorian fashion, this fasting wasn't just about skipping a meal or two. No, it was about fasting for days on end, drinking only weak broths, or in some extreme cases, barely sipping on water, all while your body screamed for the nourishment it had been deprived of. There's nothing quite like the feeling of complete exhaustion paired with the satisfying thought that you are detoxing in the name of health. You might faint from hunger, but hey, at least your humors would be in perfect balance, right? Now let's talk about the bloodletting fad, which was considered another form of detox by the Victorians. Bloodletting, though, was a practice that went beyond the herbs and fasting. The idea was simple. Remove some of your blood to rid your body of evil spirits, bad humors, or any number of imagined ailments. The Victorians didn't have modern medicine, so they thought a little blood loss here and there could do wonders for their health. And who needs a doctor when you've got a leech? These little critters were applied to your body as a natural remedy, their sole purpose being to suck out the bad stuff. In reality, you were probably left with a couple of small bite marks and a distinct feeling of being taken advantage of. But in a world where you couldn't trust a headache without it being some sign of a serious disease, bloodletting was just another part of your health journey. Despite all the suffering, the discomfort, and the sheer absurdity of these detoxes, the Victorians truly believed they were doing the right thing. They thought they were working toward a cleaner, more refined version of themselves. But in reality, what they were doing was making themselves miserable and probably a lot sicker. While modern-day detoxes usually consist of cutting out junk, food, and drinking lots of water, Victorians went the extra mile, incorporating bizarre and harmful health practices into their daily routines. So what did they get out of it? The answer is unclear, but it certainly wasn't the healthy, glowing bodies they envisioned. The only thing they gained was a reputation for being well-to-do and cultured, willing to endure the discomforts of the latest health trends in order to maintain their status. After all, nothing says I care about my well-being like vomiting into a bucket after drinking an herbal tonic that smells like feet. Maybe the real lesson here is that some fads, no matter how fashionable, are best left in the past. In the Victorian world, socializing was an art form. No texting or Facebook invites. Instead, it was all about the opera, formal dances, and excessively awkward small talk. Just how many events could you attend before losing your will to live, or at least your desire to attend any more parties? For the Victorians, socializing wasn't just a pastime. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, a series of events designed to display wealth, propriety, and the ability to avoid accidentally insulting someone by speaking out of turn. It wasn't enough to simply enjoy an evening with friends. You had to execute it flawlessly. Imagine this. It's January 1st, and you've resolved to be more social in the coming year. No more hiding in your study reading dusty books. No, this year, you're going to attend every gala, every ball, every opera, and every dinner party your social circle throws at you. You've bought your finest dress or most tailored suit, complete with gloves and top, hats, and you're ready to mingle. At least that's the plan. The reality, however, is much less glamorous. The evening begins with the first challenge, the introduction. You're swept into the grand foyer of the opera house, and you can already feel your stomach tightening. The Victorians didn't do casual greetings. No, hey, how's it going? Or a quick handshake here. No, you must bow, curtsy, and address your fellow guests with full titles. Ah, Lord Abernathy, so wonderful to see you this fine evening, you might say, while secretly wondering who this Lord Abernathy is and why he insists on wearing such an absurdly large cravat. Meanwhile, he's eyeing your own outfit, probably judging whether or not your velvet waistcoat is the right shade of purple. It's as if socializing were a game of who can outclass the other. It was a world where the tiniest mistake could land you in social exile. Slip up and refer to someone as Mr. Stevenson instead of Sir Stevenson, and you may as well pack your bags for the next available ship to a remote colony. But of course, it's not just the introductions that make Victorian socializing such a nightmare. It's small talk. In today's world, small talk might revolve around the weather or whether or not your coworker watched the latest Netflix series. Not so in Victorian England. If you dared to bring up anything less than the highest level of propriety, say discussing an art exhibit, the latest philosophical work, or the grand political affairs of Europe, you might as well have started talking about your favorite breakfast cereal. Your conversation partners would stare at you as if you'd suggested wearing your Panamas to a royal wedding. Every conversation was an opportunity to prove that you had the intellectual and moral depth to be part of such an exalted company. Then comes dinner. Imagine being seated at a long, candlelit table, surrounded by people you hardly know. The menu, likely a 12-course extravaganza that takes so long to serve that by the time you've reached the 9th course, you've forgotten what the first one tasted like. And let's not even discuss the etiquette involved. Forks and knives had to be used in specific ways, wine glasses held at certain angles, and even the way you chewed your food had to be in accordance with social norms. One wrong move, chewing too loudly, putting your elbows on the table, or making eye contact with the wrong person, and you could quickly find yourself banished to the lower ranks of society. The social stakes were higher than the price of the meal itself. As the evening progresses, you're then led to the opera. The opera, the crown jewel of Victorian socializing. The cheater was where the elite gathered to show off their most refined selves, whispering to each other between acts about the performance, the performers, and how very insightful their opinions were. You couldn't just watch the opera, you had to experience it, using all the appropriate hand gestures and comments about the acoustics. If you dared to enjoy the performance in silence, you might be regarded as some sort of barbarian. Socializing at the opera was all about making sure everyone knew you were cultured and refined enough to appreciate both the music and the status that came with attending such a prestigious event. But here's the kicker. After all this socializing, after the awkward conversations, the long dinners, the grand entrances and exits, you still had to do it all over again. Victorian society was built on a never-ending cycle of balls, dinners, and outings. The social calendar was packed with so many events that you had to attend them whether you liked it or not. Because let's face it, if you didn't show up, you might as well have been invisible. If you refused too many invitations, whispers would begin to circulate. Is something wrong with Lord Pembroke? I hear he's turning down all invitations to the opera this season. I suspect he's fallen ill, or worse, lost his taste for culture. After a while, you might start to wonder if you've actually made any real progress on your New Year's resolution to be more social, or if you've simply exhausted yourself with one too many waltzes and endless rounds of awkward pleasantries. You've shaken hands with more people than you can count. You've offered your most polite smiles, and you've spent more time thinking about how to socialize than why you're doing it in the first place. Socializing in the Victorian era wasn't just about enjoying the company of others. It was a relentless series of performances that left you wondering if you'd ever get to relax in the comfort of your own home again. By the time the year is over, you may have had the perfect social year, but you'll likely be left with an overwhelming sense of exhaustion and a longing for the next holiday, where the only thing you'll be expected to do is enjoy a quiet cup of tea. Ever wanted to be more cultured? The Victorians didn't just aim to read more books, they wanted to read all the books and know all the art and appreciate all the music. It was basically their version of Netflix binges, except with more snobbery. For the Victorians, culture wasn't just a hobby, it was a lifestyle. It was a form of self-improvement that required constant attention, investment, and above all, an audience to witness your efforts. And if you were really committed to the cause of becoming cultured, your New Year's resolution likely involved diving headfirst into a sea of literature, opera, art galleries, and philosophical discussions, all in the name of sophistication. The goal wasn't just knowledge, it was status. The more you knew, the more you were respected. Now let's imagine that you've made this very resolution for the upcoming year. You're going to become the most refined version of yourself, and nothing is going to stand in your way, not even the looming, overwhelming mountain of works by obscure European philosophers, or the mind-blindingly long symphonies of the great composers. You're on a mission to read everything from Dostoevsky to Dickens, from Shakespeare to to the latest philosophical treatise on what it means to be human. And let's face it, it's not like any of these books are quick reads. But you know it's for the greater good. You're cultivating your mind, expanding your horizons, and, most importantly, showing off your newfound knowledge to anyone who'll listen. The first step? Reading. But of course, the Victorians didn't read for pleasure. No. Reading was an exercise in social currency. Imagine attending a dinner party where the conversation naturally turns to the latest trends in literature. You can't afford to be caught without an opinion. So you sit up straight, smoothing your frock or adjusting your waistcoat, and begin casually mentioning how you've just finished a book by a French existentialist that no one else at the table has ever heard of. They may have no idea what you're talking about, but your mention of the book is enough to establish you as a connoisseur of deep thought. Your resolution to be cultured is working. Next, you turn to art. Oh, the art. For the Victorians, it wasn't enough to simply appreciate a painting or sculpture. You had to know everything about it, its origins, its significance in history, and of course, its price tag. After all, the ability to critique a painting wasn't just a sign of knowledge, it was a sign of your standing in society. And so, you begin making regular visits to art galleries and museums. You stand in front of each piece, nodding solemnly and pondering the artist's intent. Maybe you've read a few articles about the Impressionists, so you throw in a casual comment like, "Ah, yes, Monet. He truly captures the transient nature of light, doesn't he?" This not only makes you sound intellectual, but also so much more sophisticated than your peers who are probably still debating what's on television. Your year of becoming cultured is well underway, at least in theory. Then comes the music. For the Victorians, music wasn't something you casually enjoyed while driving to work or at the gym. Oh no, music was an event. You didn't just listen to music, you experienced it. The opera was the ultimate flex in Victorian culture, and attending one wasn't about simply enjoying the show. It was about showcasing your appreciation for high art and signaling your place in society. You were expected to know the nuances of each aria, recognize the subtleties in the conductor's movements, and be able to discuss the composer's influence on the broader cultural landscape. If you found yourself at a party and someone mentioned the latest opera by Wagner, you'd better be ready with a thoughtful response, or risk being branded a cultural fraud. You couldn't just like music, you had to understand it, speak about it fluently, and above all, be able to judge it critically. It was the ultimate intellectual workout, all wrapped up in an evening gown or a tailcoat. But here's the kicker. The more you tried to be cultured, the more you found yourself submerged in an endless cycle of cultural consumption. There were always more books to read, more music to appreciate, more art to discuss. It was as if the pursuit of culture itself was a never-ending treadmill. And while the Victorians looked impressively sophisticated, attending galas, discussing the merits of French literature, and listening to Chopin on the regular, they were probably just as exhausted by the whole thing as anyone would be if they were trying to keep up with a New Year's resolution that involved constantly one-upping everyone else with their knowledge of obscure European movements in art and philosophy. And so, your year of cultural enlightenment continues. You've read the books, attended the shows, and casually dropped references to Proust in everyday conversations. But you start to wonder, was all this worth it? Sure, you look cultured, but did you actually enjoy any of it, or were you just playing the game? The Victorians had set an incredibly high bar for themselves, And as you try to follow in their footsteps, you realize that being cultured wasn't about enjoying life or expanding your mind. It was about maintaining an image. The more you knew, the higher you climbed in the ranks of society. But in the end, did it make them happier? Maybe, but probably not. Because in the Victorian era, true happiness came second to appearance. And after all, what good is all this culture if you never really take the time to appreciate the joy of a good, old-fashioned Netflix binge, or whatever the 19th century equivalent of mindless entertainment was? As the year winds down, you're probably more tired than enlightened. You've kept your resolution to be cultured, but now you're wondering if a simpler resolution, like learn to enjoy life without being constantly busy, might have been the better way to go. The Victorians were great at appearing cultured, but the real question is, did they actually live it? You think you have skincare routines that require patience? Wait until you hear about the Victorian beauty treatments, which often involved some form of extreme physical discomfort, like slapping your face with cold meat or spending hours submerged in lard. It was a glamorous time, wasn't it? While today's beauty trends might involve a 10-step skincare routine and a soothing sheet mask, the Victorians took a more no pain, no gain approach, where the idea of beauty through suffering was not just a metaphor, it was a lifestyle. The concept of glowing skin was far less about relaxation and more about enduring what felt like a medieval torture session, all in the name of looking youthful, fair, and respectable. First off, let's talk about the most popular treatment of the time, the cold meat facial. Yes, you read that correctly. Cold meat. It's hard to imagine now, but in Victorian society, slapping a bit of cold beef or veal on your face was considered a way to tone and tighten the skin. The theory was that the cold temperature would stimulate circulation, and the protein in the meat would somehow refresh your complexion. The only problem with this? It probably just left your face smelling like a butcher's shop and feeling strangely greasy, but that didn't seem to deter anyone. Victorian beauty was all about suffering in silence. Your face could be red, swollen, and slightly odorous, but if you were told it would make you more beautiful, you simply endured it. But let's not forget the ultimate in skincare luxury, the lard facial. Yes, you guessed it, smeared with lard. While we might now cringe at the thought of putting grease on our faces, in the 1800s, this was considered an indulgent treatment that could do wonders for dry, flaky skin. Think about it. You're preparing to apply a thick layer of animal fat to your face, all while trying to convince yourself this is for your own good. Once you've lathered it on, you let it sit for hours, believing it would soften your skin and keep it looking youthful. It's the kind of beauty treatment that seems to defy logic and personal hygiene. But in Victorian times, it was simply another day in the pursuit of perfection. Of course, lard doesn't exactly smell like roses, so you can imagine the unique fragrance you'd be rocking for the rest of the day. But it didn't matter. If it worked, it was worth it. Meanwhile, in the Victorian world, whitening the skin was all the rage. No, not with SPF 50 or gentle defoliators. The fairer your complexion, the more refined you were considered. To achieve this, women and sometimes men would apply layers of lead-based makeup, which had a charming side effect. It poisoned you slowly over time. Yes, lead-based cosmetics were popular because they made the skin appear paler, but these products were incredibly toxic. It's almost as though no one bothered to ask the question, hey, Does covering your face in something that's literally toxic have any negative side effects? Spoiler alert, it did. Not only did the lead-based cosmetics cause skin damage, but they also contributed to a range of health problems like headaches, seizures, and digestive issues. But no worries, it was worth the pale complexion. It was, after all, the ideal beauty standard of the time. If you weren't into the whole lead and lard approach to beauty, perhaps you could go for the weirdly natural alternatives. For example, many Victorians swore by the use of raw egg whites as a facial mask, convinced that the proteins would tighten their pores and smooth their skin. While egg whites might sound harmless enough, they weren't always fresh, and the risk of salmonella was certainly not top of mind in the 1800s. The process involved slathering the slimy mixture onto your face and leaving it to dry, which, by the way, made talking or even moving your face nearly impossible. But hey, nothing screams luxury quite like a stiff egg mask that left you feeling both sticky and terrified of the germs you might be unknowingly incubating. But there was more. If you didn't have access to the latest in meat slapping or egg-faced treatments, there was always the nature route, because, of course, nature had the answers to all your beauty woes. In the Victorian era, herbal remedies were all the rage. Rose water, lavender, and chamomile were common, but these remedies had a catch. You had to mix them up yourself, often creating concoctions that smelled so strange they could only be described as nature's nightmare. The thought of soaking your skin in these fragrant brews wasn't nearly as relaxing as it sounds. It was more about the ritual, the sense that you were doing something ancient and wise, even if it only left your face feeling like it had been dipped in a flower garden's leftovers. Still, it was natural, and that was all that mattered. But let's take a moment to appreciate the Victorians for their dedication. They were committed to the idea that beauty was pain, literally. And yet, despite all these trials and tribulations, despite the cold meat facials and the toxic makeup, they did manage to achieve the appearance of flawless beauty, or at least that's what they believed. Today, when we look at these practices, it's hard not to wonder if all that suffering was worth it. In the end, the Victorian pursuit of beauty wasn't just about the results. It was about the willingness to endure any discomfort to achieve an ideal, even if that meant slathering your skin in animal fat or using poisonous cosmetics. So as you apply your gentle, calming face masks today with ingredients like aloe or honey, take a moment to reflect on the true luxury of modern beauty. No cold meat, no lead, no lard. Just smooth, soothing products, and most importantly, no serious side effects. In the end, maybe the Victorian beauty regimen wasn't all glamour after all. Speaking of discomfort, let's dive into the beauty of hygiene in 1885. In an era where regular bathing was a luxury due to limited hot water, how did people keep their resolutions to smell nice? Spoiler alert, they didn't. But they sure tried. The Victorians may have prided themselves on their social graces, their elegant manners, and their impeccable fashion, but when it came to personal hygiene, their efforts were, well, a bit less refined. A daily bath wasn't a standard part of life for most people, and let's just say that scented wasn't always synonymous with fresh. Now, if you've ever had a New Year's resolution to take better care of yourself, to smell good, or to refresh your routine, you might find the Victorian approach a bit disappointing. With the advent of modern plumbing still in the distant future, water was often something you had to save. And since hot water was an even more precious commodity, the idea of a leisurely bath was considered an extravagance reserved for the wealthy. For the average Victorian, a bath was more of a rare treat or a very elaborate procedure rather than a routine habit. For the most part, people had to make do with what they had, and what they had was not much. For the wealthy elite, the occasional bath was possible, but it wasn't always as refreshing as you might think. Imagine stepping into a tub filled with lukewarm water, possibly shared by multiple family members or servants, before soap made a real appearance as a truly hygienic product. It was more likely that people would take a sponge bath, wiping themselves down with a damp cloth, hoping to somehow feel fresh. But again, this wasn't something that happened every day. A weekly scrub might have been more of a luxury than a necessity, and, as for the rest of the week, a few spritzes of cologne or scented powder were your best bet for convincing the world that you hadn't gone days without a proper wash. Well, of course, no one wanted to smell bad. That would never do, especially in a world so focused on social appearances and propriety. So in place of regular baths, the Victorians relied heavily on other methods to mask their natural odors. Take, for example, the use of heavy perfumes. These were not light floral scents, just like we might use today, but overpowering, cloying concoctions that often mixed alcohol with oils, musk, and floral notes. The idea was to cover up any natural body odor and to do it with flair. But if you were in the lower classes and perfumes were a luxury you couldn't afford, you might resort to something more creative. Enter the postures de toilette, powdered scents that you would liberally dust onto your skin and clothing. These powders, often made from ingredients like lavender or rose petals, were meant to absorb any unpleasant smells and add a layer of refinement to your day. You could sprinkle it on your hair, on your skin, and even on your clothing. The idea was to keep yourself smelling like flowers, not sweat. But if you weren't careful, you'd end up with an overpowering mix of rose-scented clothing and, well, an unfortunate amount of body odor trapped underneath. For those who couldn't afford such luxuries, the situation was a bit grim. Poorer Victorians had to make do with much less. They didn't have the resources to buy fancy powders or perfumes, so their daily hygiene rituals were pretty much reduced to whatever could be managed with a simple cloth or handkerchief. And forget about deodorant. It hadn't been invented yet. People in the lower classes often had to rely on homemade remedies, some of which, ironically, could be worse than doing nothing at all. Vinegar, herbs, and even a quick wash with cold water were the best they could do to try to mask odors, but they didn't have access to the same kinds of luxury or convenience that their wealthier counterparts did. So personal hygiene for them often meant simply trying to make do in a world that didn't prioritize cleanliness in the same way we do today. But it wasn't just about smelling fresh. It was also about avoiding diseases. While the wealthy could indulge in the occasional bath, the masses were concerned about the risks of contracting diseases, especially during outbreaks of cholera or tuberculosis. So they did what they could to avoid close contact with people who appeared to be sick. They would wear heavy layers of clothing, especially in colder months, as a way to protect themselves from germs and illness. But these layers also trapped heat and, unfortunately, doors. As for those who lived in close quarters, such as in crowded cities or even in cramped, unsanitary conditions, staying clean was a constant struggle. The air was often thick with smoke, sewage smells, and the stench of overcrowded living spaces, So even if you did manage to wash your face with a damp cloth, the overall environment made it nearly impossible to escape unpleasant smells. One of the most intriguing yet baffling aspects of Victorian hygiene was the use of door-proof garments. These were often tight-fitting corsets, gloves, and socks designed not to let body doors escape, keeping them trapped inside. The idea was to preserve your dignity and avoid offending others, even if it meant creating a personal steam chamber inside your own clothing. The problem? These garments didn't exactly breathe in the modern sense, so they may have trapped as much sweat as they did door. It was a vicious cycle of out of sight, out of mind, except the mind and everyone else in the room was still very much aware of the results. As you look back at these practices, you can't help but feel a little grateful for modern hygiene standards. Today, we have hot water at the turn of a faucet, a wide range of skincare products, and the luxury of deodorants and soaps that don't involve rubbing lard on your skin. And so, as you settle into bed after a long day, perhaps a quiet thank you to indoor plumbing and effective hygiene products is in order. Because while Victorian efforts at cleanliness may have been noble, we definitely don't envy their methods. The Victorians were obsessed with balance, work, rest, socializing, but somehow they could never quite get it right. Between overwork and underrest, their version of balance was a little more chaotic than the modern version of trying to make it to your yoga class. The idea that work and life should coexist in harmony was a relatively new concept, but the Victorians, ever the overachievers, took it to the extreme. They were determined to be productive, to appear refined, and to uphold social expectations. Yet despite their efforts, they were constantly on the edge of burnout. Instead of achieving balance, they created a perpetual cycle of exhaustion, stress, and endless social obligations. Let's take a closer look at a typical Victorian workday. If you were one of the upper crust, you might start the day by attending a meeting at 8 a.m., followed by hours of business correspondence, strategic planning, and meetings with various professionals. The work itself might not have been physically taxing, but the mental demands were high. Imagine being expected to always be sharp, articulate, and presentable, not just in the office, but in every interaction with colleagues, clients, and peers. There was no such thing as turning off. You were constantly representing your family's name and reputation, which meant maintaining a flawless image at all times. Not to mention the stress of keeping up with the expectations placed upon you, owning a grand home, sending children to prestigious schools, and entertaining at lavish parties. At the same time, the Victorians were also firm believers in rest, but of course, they did it their way. A typical afternoon nap was a must for any self-respecting Victorian. While we might think of a midday rest as a luxury or indulgence, for the Victorians, it was a necessary part of their daily routine. The problem, however, was that these naps weren't exactly restful. After a busy morning of work, meetings, and social calls, you'd find yourself lying down for a brief rest, perhaps in an overly ornate bedroom with lace curtains and heavy velvet furniture. This rest wasn't about relaxation. It was about recharging to look your best for the next round of dinner parties and social engagements. How could you possibly show up at a soiree without being completely refreshed after all those hours of high society exertions? But this obsession with balance came at a price. For many Victorians, it was an endless cycle of overwork and guilt-filled rest. In their pursuit of the perfect work-life balance, They often found themselves struggling to meet the demands of both, never fully succeeding in either realm. Workdays dragged on for hours, with minimal downtime in between. Yet the pressure to maintain social status and perform in social settings meant that rest, when it came, was often unfulfilling. A nap didn't provide the restorative relief we might expect today. It was more about avoiding social awkwardness or criticism for being lazy. On top of this, Victorian socializing was an exhausting endeavor in itself. Picture this. After a long day of work, the last thing you'd want to do is head off to a formal dinner or gala where you'd have to engage in polite conversation, engage in complex social dances, and smile through hours of tedious chatter. It's not that the Victorians disliked socializing. They often found it invigorating, but the sheer amount of social obligations meant that rest was rarely truly restful. After a long dinner, you might find yourself rushing off to yet another engagement, or worse, another round of business meetings the following morning. It's as if the very concept of relaxation was doomed by social performance and constant interaction. So how did the Victorians manage their so-called work-life balance? It's hard to say they did. Their balance looked more like a teetering tower of exhaustion, stress, and barely held together social obligations. The constant cycle of working hard, resting lightly, and socializing endlessly left them feeling perpetually on edge. And of course, this imbalance had long-term consequences. Many Victorians, particularly those in the upper classes, suffered from chronic stress, anxiety, and a variety of physical ailments brought on by overwork and neglect of their own health. Now let's take a moment to reflect on what this means for us today. We live in a world that constantly strives for the same balance the Victorians sought, but unlike them, we have access to more information about mental health and self-care. Our version of balance looks a little different. We prioritize rest, mindfulness, and taking breaks when needed. We talk about mental health openly, and wellness apps and meditation retreats are now part of the mainstream conversation. But in many ways, we still struggle with the same tension the Victorians did. How many of us rush between work and social engagements, struggling to find true moments of rest? How many of us use social media or our devices as a means of escape instead of truly disengaging and recharging? In some ways, the Victorian approach to balance has left us with a legacy that still haunts us. They set the stage for the modern obsession with achieving perfection in every area of life: work, social status, and health. But at what cost? The Victorians never truly achieved balance. They simply muddled through, worn out by their own ideals. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson we can learn from them. Balance isn't about doing everything perfectly. It's about understanding that you can't always be everything to everyone. Sometimes true balance means taking a step back and allowing yourself to rest without guilt. In the end, the Victorian pursuit of balance was less about harmony and more about keeping up appearances. But today, we have the opportunity to rethink what balance means for us and how we can better live within our own limits. So maybe, just maybe, we should leave the hustle and burnout model behind and learn from the Victorians by truly understanding when it's time to work and when it's time to rest. You think diets are hard now? Imagine living in a world where you're surrounded by cakes, tarts, and puddings at every turn and trying to keep your resolution to eat less sugar. The amount of self-control it took to resist an entire buffet of sugary goodness? We're not sure it ever happened. The Victorians were blessed, or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with a veritable buffet of desserts that were impossible to ignore. Their version of dieting wasn't just about cutting back, it was about surviving the endless parade of cakes, pies, and sugary treats that were in constant circulation at every social gathering. And don't even get started on the dinner parties. Let's picture it. You've made your New Year's resolution, determined to eat less sugar, cut back on sweets, and maintain a sense of self-discipline in a world that doesn't make it easy. You're preparing to face your first challenge, the annual grand dinner hosted by your wealthiest friend. As you walk in, the entire room smells of sugar, butter, and warm spices. There, right in the middle of the dining table, is the pièce de résistance, the dessert buffet. A towering cake glazed with honey, sugar-filled fruit tarts, delicate pastries filled with cream, and a chocolate pudding that looks like it was made to be devoured. Your resolution to eat less sugar suddenly feels like a bad joke. But hey, you're determined to push through. After all, you've come this far, right? Unfortunately, for the Victorians, avoiding these tempting treats wasn't just about willpower. It was about social expectations. You see, in the Victorian era, food was often used as a marker of status. The more lavish your spread, the higher your social standing. Wealthy families had access to the finest ingredients, including sugar, which was still considered a luxury, making desserts not just a treat, but a symbol of affluence. When you attended a social gathering, refusing dessert wasn't just a personal decision. It could be seen as a sign of poor taste, even a lack of refinement. So even though you had every intention of sticking to your resolution, you found yourself forced to partake in a lavish dessert course just to fit in. Now let's talk about the truly absurd side of Victorian dieting, fad diets. While today's low-carb, keto, and intermittent fasting trends seem to dominate the dieting world, the Victorians had their own strange methods of trying to achieve what they saw as the perfect body. One of the most popular dietary approaches was the water cure, which was exactly what it sounds like. You'd spend hours drinking large amounts of water, believing that it would cleanse your body and keep your digestion in check. Unfortunately, the Victorians didn't quite have the scientific understanding of nutrition that we do today, so they often drank water in excess and under strange circumstances, like before or after meals, hoping it would flush out whatever was deemed bad for their health. While hydration is important, the overconsumption of water without proper balance led to bloating, discomfort, and a feeling of self-righteousness, but not necessarily the results they were hoping for. The Victorian era was also obsessed with the idea of fasting. Fasting wasn't just about spiritual enlightenment. For the Victorians, it was seen as a way to purify the body and maintain control over one's physical desires. You could fast for a day or even longer, all in the name of health, and to a certain extent, this worked as a short-term detox. But the problem was that it only fueled the binge recovery cycle. After a long fast, you were faced with a monumental craving for food, specifically rich, sugary foods that you had denied yourself. The floodgates would open, and all the resolve you built up over the fast would go out the window as you dug into that cake you had been salivating over for days. So in the end, fasting only made the indulgence feel more rewarding, perpetuating an unhealthy relationship with food. Then there were the herbal remedies, often recommended as a way to curb the desire for sweets. Think of them as the Victorian version of detox teas. People were often encouraged to drink concoctions made from herbs like peppermint, dandelion, or horehound, which were supposed to suppress hunger and improve digestion. But like today's detox drinks, the effects were debatable at best, and these herbal potions often led to more discomfort than results. Imagine sipping on a bitter, grassy drink in the hopes of curbing your sweet tooth, only to feel bloated and slightly nauseous as you're surrounded by an entire room full of decadent desserts. In fact, much of Victorian dieting was wrapped up in contradictions. On one hand, you were encouraged to avoid the temptation of sweet treats and indulge in bland, healthful foods. On the other, the wealth and status of the time were often directly tied to how much sugar you could afford to consume and serve. The more sugar you could incorporate into your meals, the more sophisticated and wealthy you seemed. So while you might have a fleeting moment of triumph by resisting that tart, you'd likely end up feeling guilt-ridden for not partaking in the decadent spread around you, knowing full well that abstinence could mark you as socially inept. Eventually, the Victorian obsession with diet, appearance, and control came to a head, especially when it came to food. The resolution to eat less sugar often fell apart in the face of opulence, because while the Victorians wanted to appear disciplined and refined, they also wanted to partake in all the pleasures that came with wealth. And who could blame them? How could you possibly resist a spread of cakes and pies when your social standing depended on it? In the end, the real victors were the chefs who created the confections and the socialites who indulged, resolution or not. The Victorian diet, in all its glory, may have been a series of trials and tribulations, but it wasn't exactly a recipe for lasting self-control. The Victorians had a very strict idea of morality, especially when it came to religion. So how did they juggle the desire to be pious with the reality of surviving a year filled with scandalous parties and gossip? Spoiler, not very well. In the 1800s, a good Christian life wasn't just about attending Sunday services and reading the Bible. No, it was an all-encompassing lifestyle that demanded constant vigilance, a spotless reputation, and a daily commitment to self-denial. It was a time when the pressure to appear virtuous was so intense that it practically defined social life. The Victorians were obsessed with maintaining a moral image, but beneath the surface, the hypocrisy was rampant. After all, how could anyone possibly live up to the standard of moral perfection they had set for themselves while also navigating the temptations of a rapidly changing society? For a Victorian to be considered a good Christian, it wasn't enough to simply avoid the obvious sins like drunkenness or theft. You also had to look like a good Christian. Your actions, your words, your dress, everything had to reflect a strict adherence to Christian values. Public piety was paramount. If you were a Victorian Christian, you would probably start your day with a prayer, perhaps spend time reflecting on Scripture, and make sure you never ever engaged in anything that might be perceived as immoral, such as gambling, swearing, or showing too much emotion. In fact, the Victorians prided themselves on their ability to remain stoic and composed in all situations, even while secretly they were probably just as prone to temptation as the next person. But let's be real here. The Victorian world was full of temptations, and they were practically impossible to avoid. The Victorians were living in an era of massive social change, with the rise of industrialization, expanding cities, and the emergence of the middle class. This was an age of excess, abundant parties, lavish balls, and yes, plenty of gossip. Yet the church insisted that you keep up appearances and maintain your moral fortitude. This meant that while you may have secretly enjoyed a night of revelry, behind closed doors, you had to make sure your conduct was beyond reproach. The fact that you were surrounded by temptations didn't matter. What mattered was how you handled them. Let's take the social scene as an example. A Victorian gentleman or lady was expected to attend balls, dinner parties, and social gatherings, where everything from casual flirtation to gossip could land you in moral peril. A mere flirtation could be seen as a moral failing, something that could damage your reputation permanently. But the reality? Well, the reality was that everyone gossiped. Everyone had a little too much to drink now and then, and everyone danced a little too closely. Even the most devout among them were still trying to balance their Christian ideals with the realities of socializing in an increasingly secular world. There was a clear divide between public virtue and private indulgence, though most people worked hard to maintain the illusion of purity and righteousness. This double life was perhaps most evident in Victorian marriages. On the outside, these unions were often seen as models of Christian morality, with couples maintaining strict codes of behavior and focusing on raising children in the faith. But behind the scenes, many marriages were strained by the pressures of maintaining these ideals. For women especially, being a good Christian meant more than just attending church. It was about being the epitome of domesticity. Women were expected to be the moral compass of the home, nurturing children and husbands alike. But how did they balance this responsibility with their own desires, frustrations, and personal lives? Well, the answer was often that they didn't. Many women found themselves trapped in loveless marriages, forced to maintain appearances while silently suffocating under the weight of societal expectations. For men, the pressure to be a good Christian came in the form of both public and private duty. Not only were they expected to be the head of the household, but they were also supposed to be pillars of the community. If a man was seen at the local pub, even for a simple drink, it could tarnish his reputation. If he attended a party where the socializing became a bit too free-spirited, he was expected to leave early to avoid being associated with any moral failings. Yet as with the women, there was a great deal of hypocrisy involved. Many men, while maintaining an image of Christian perfection, indulged in affairs, gambling, or other vices in private. The idea was to appear respectable while navigating the world's temptations in secret. But eventually, the double life took its toll, and the moral failures could no longer be hidden behind the facade of piety. But the real kicker, the ultimate test of Victorian piety, was the relentless pursuit of moral purity in every aspect of life. If you weren't constantly striving to be a better Christian, if you didn't live every day with a strict adherence to Christian values, you were seen as failing, not just as a person, but as a moral citizen. The Victorians didn't just want to avoid sin, they wanted to improve themselves daily. For them, being a good Christian wasn't just about following the rules. It was about striving for perfection, constantly working to better yourself in every way. The pressure was enormous. By the end of the year, as you look back at your own resolutions and compare them to the Victorians' moral ideals, you might realize just how much easier it is to maintain a balance today. Sure, we might still grapple with the pressures of modern life, but we don't have to contend with a society that demands perfection in every area of life. The Victorians' idea of being a good Christian wasn't just about following religious teachings. It was about presenting yourself as morally flawless, day in and day out without fail. So maybe, just maybe, we can cut ourselves a little slack the next time we miss a New Year's resolution or struggle with the concept of perfection. Because if the Victorians couldn't quite pull it off, we're probably doing okay. Forget gym memberships. The Victorians resolved to get fitter by just taking long walks in the cold, sometimes in the middle of a snowstorm. If they weren't getting stronger, at least they were getting frostbite. The Victorian obsession with fitness wasn't about sculpting muscles in a state-of-the-art gym with the latest workout equipment. No, their approach to physical fitness was far more rustic and unnecessarily harsh. The idea was simple. To be healthy, you just needed to get outside, face the elements, and keep moving, whether it was snowing, raining, or absolutely freezing. This no-excuses approach to fitness would make any modern fitness guru break into a sweat just thinking about it. Imagine, if you will, that you're a Victorian, determined to make this the year you get in shape. Forget the idea of a treadmill or fancy weight machines. You head outside in your wooden overcoat, top hat, and scarf, and resolve to walk through the city streets for at least an hour, day. You could do this in any weather, but the best kind of exercise was, of course, in the worst conditions. The Victorians didn't shy away from adversity. They embraced it. A light drizzle? Perfect for a brisk walk to build stamina. A gusty wind that feels like it might knock you over? Even better for toughening up. In fact, walking in harsh weather conditions was considered an ideal form of exercise. The colder, the better. If you didn't come home with rosy cheeks, windburned skin, and a slightly numb nose, were you even exercising properly? But it wasn't just the weather that dictated fitness for Victorians. Their definition of exercise was all about endurance and practical purpose. If they weren't walking for fitness, they were probably riding horses for transportation, or maybe hauling heavy buckets of water, since running water wasn't a given for everyone. It was less about getting fit and more about surviving and enduring the tough physical conditions of daily life. And when you weren't walking or riding, you were likely engaging in a form of exercise that didn't feel like exercise at all. Consider bathing practices in the Victorian era. Bathing required a lot of walking around to find hot water or lug buckets to and from the bathroom, which itself involved a lot of bending and stretching. If you wanted to step it up a notch, there was always the option of engaging in popular Victorian outdoor sports like croquet or archery, but these were seen less as fitness regimens and more as leisure activities for the aristocracy. For the common Victorian, however, physical exercise meant activities with practical, functional purposes, such as farming, carrying firewood, or shoveling snow. These activities were labor-intensive, but got the job done without the need for an overpriced gym membership or group fitness class. And then there were the more extreme forms of fitness that Victorians might attempt in the name of self-improvement. Take the popular cold water plunge, for example. Some Victorians would dive into icy rivers or lakes during the winter months, convinced that it was the ultimate way to boost health and stamina. The idea was that if you could endure the freezing shock of icy water, you would purify both your body and mind. It's not hard to imagine how this could backfire. A dip in cold water could leave you feeling exhilarated for a moment, but it could also lead to hypothermia, which was hardly the health benefit they were hoping for. But no matter the outcome, it was certainly an experience that required an intense amount of physical and mental fortitude. For the wealthier Victorians, exercise sometimes meant attending organized sports events like cricket or rugby, but even these involved more socializing than actual rigorous training. However, for the vast majority of the population, physical activity was deeply rooted in daily survival and the labor of the working class. The Victorians didn't have personal trainers or fitness blogs to follow, but they had to be physically fit simply to get through the demands of their lives. Whether that meant working long hours in a factory or walking for hours to get from one place to another, they were forced into fitness by the very nature of their existence. Let's not forget the Victorian fascination with staying fit to survive, particularly among the upper classes, who considered it vital to keep up appearances of vitality. You see, the Victorians were as concerned with looking healthy as they were with actually being healthy. Fitness was part of their moral framework. If you were fit, it was assumed that you were also disciplined, strong-willed, and virtuous. But the truth was, much of the physical exertion Victorians underwent was less about wellness and more about showing off their ability to withstand hardship with poise. The aristocracy may have taken pride in their ability to endure a brisk walk or horseback ride, but it was the working classes who were truly putting in the laborious, physically demanding hours. By the time you've finished your brisk walk in freezing temperatures, your muscles sore and your nose red, you might start to wonder, was the Victorian method of fitness really worth it? Sure, it might have been practical, but it was hardly comfortable. Compared to the sleek, climate-controlled gyms of today, the Victorian approach to staying fit was far from luxurious, and it wasn't exactly tailored to anyone's individual needs. But in a way, that's what made it so admirable. They embraced a lifestyle of fitness based on endurance, overcoming obstacles, and making the most of what they had, even if it was just a pair of sturdy boots and an unforgiving wind. In the end, perhaps that's the true definition of Victorian fitness: surviving the harshness of the world with a sense of purpose and an unshockable commitment to physical resilience. When it came to romance, Victorians were all about resolution, but in the most absurdly formal way. No texting, "Hey, what's up?" in the middle of the night. Instead, it was about long letters, moonlit walks, and vows of eternal devotion. Spoiler, no one ever followed through with the vows. Romance in the Victorian era wasn't just about finding someone to love. It was about navigating an entire labyrinth of social expectations, rigid rules, and impossible ideals. If you made a romantic resolution in the 1800s, you could bet that it would involve an endless cycle of restrained emotion, carefully worded declarations, and excessively elaborate gestures. After all, the Victorians had a very particular view of romance, and it wasn't exactly based on real feelings, but on the appearance of feelings. Imagine this. You've resolved to become the most romantic and proper Victorian lover of the year. The first step? Forget about texting or casual calls. Instead, you're writing long, beautifully crafted letters by candlelight, perhaps using a quill and ink, your handwriting as elegant and poised as your intention. These letters weren't just about expressing affection. They were about displaying your ability to master the art of poetic language. Every word had to be carefully chosen. A slip-up could ruin your reputation. If you were in love, you had to sound serious about it, and that meant writing declarations of everlasting devotion that could stretch across pages. Even the simplest "I love you" needed to be dressed up with layers of metaphor and allegory. Love letters weren't just communication, they were performances, a way of demonstrating your worth as a lover. The next step? Oh, that's where the moonlit walks come in. Romantic outings in the Victorian era weren't just about going for a nice stroll in the park. They were ceremonious events that required a great deal of preparation. Picture this. You've managed to arrange a walk with your beau or belle. But wait, there's more. You couldn't just wander aimlessly down a path. No. It had to be a specific route, ideally under the cover of twilight, where the shadows would be long, the air cool, and the world would feel as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of your words. You would walk side by side, your hand perhaps just inches from theirs, and yet the rules dictated that you could never touch unless it was in a moment of profound emotional significance. And don't even think about kissing on that first walk. That was reserved for only the most serious of commitments. If the walk wasn't slow and deliberate, if it wasn't full of meaningful pauses and symbolic gestures, it would be considered an affront to the romantic ideals you were trying to convey. Now, let's not forget about the formal courtship. Victorian courtship rituals were like a full-time job, requiring a staggering amount of commitment and careful management. The resolution to be a proper Victorian lover came with a hefty to-do list, frequent visits to your sweetheart's house, but never too frequently, always accompanied by a chaperone or two who could report back on your every move, and a series of carefully timed gifts. Flowers, absolutely, but only the right kind, nothing too bold or suggestive. A gift of a red rose? That might suggest impetuous passion. Stick to white roses, which symbolized purity, or perhaps violets, which stood for modesty. Each gesture was a performance, a test of your propriety and seriousness. These courtship rituals were almost like a game, but a game with real consequences, because if you failed to meet these lofty expectations, you'd find yourself branded as a flirt, or worse, a rogue. But wait, what about those vows of eternal devotion? The Victorians were all about vows and promises, especially when it came to love. To be a proper lover meant making lofty, idealistic promises about your future together, and these promises often sounded more like a declaration of purpose than an expression of actual desire. The Victorians were obsessed with the idea of romantic love leading to eternal commitment, but in many cases, it was an illusion. While the words of devotion flowed freely, "I will love you until the end of time," the reality was that marriage often had little to do with romantic love. It was about status, practicality, and family ties. Those grand declarations of devotion were often written in letters and spoken in hushed tones, but the reality of marriage was often far from the perfect ideal. Now let's talk about the love triangle of it all. In many cases, a Victorian romance wasn't a straightforward affair. Enter the love triangle, where a suitor would court one woman while also being pursued by a rival. The rules for romantic relationships were so complex that people could find themselves caught in an endless game of who was more serious, who was waiting for the other to make the first move, and who had the right to make the first proposal. These dynamics weren't just stressful, they were exhausting. And yet, they were all seen as part of the proper way to find love. In a time where emotional restraint was valued above all else, passionate declarations often felt more like a formality than an actual connection. The Victorian resolution to be a proper lover wasn't necessarily about real love. It was about following the rules of a deeply entrenched, emotionally convoluted system. By the time the year ends, you might find yourself exhausted by the constant performances of love and devotion, only to realize that you've never actually felt anything that could match the intensity of the vows you made. The resolution to be the perfect lover might have led to a whole lot of awkward, emotionless rituals, but the actual experience of love was often left unexplored, buried beneath layers of societal expectations. So, as you consider your own New Year's resolutions for love, remember the Victorians. It's easy to get caught up in the performance of romance, but real love requires something more than rules and formalities. The Victorians didn't just make resolutions for themselves, they also made them for their families. So imagine making a resolution to turn your home into a well-oiled machine of polite behavior while simultaneously dealing with the drama of your in-laws. Yikes. In the 1800s, family life was more than just about personal goals. It was about creating an environment that reflected the ideals of Victorian society. This meant controlling not only your own behavior, but the behavior of everyone within your household, from your children to your servants, and even extended family members. It was as if there was a constant, unspoken competition to have the most refined, most orderly home, and if your family didn't measure up, well, there were plenty of ways to make sure everyone knew it. The Victorian era was marked by a strict set of moral and social codes, and these were seen as essential for maintaining respectability. Your home, in essence, was a reflection of your character, so maintaining a proper household became an all-consuming New Year's resolution. The Victorians believed that the family unit needed to adhere to a rigid structure where everyone had clearly defined roles and responsibilities. And the most important of these was maintaining the appearance of order, cleanliness, and harmony, because if you didn't, it was a mark of failure in the eyes of society. But here's the kicker. Achieving this ideal home required an extraordinary amount of control. As the Victorian head of the household, your New Year's resolution wasn't just about keeping things neat and tidy. It was about shaping your family into model citizens who adhered to the social codes of the time. Want your children to be well behaved? You'd have to maintain strict discipline, none of that modern, gentle parenting stuff. Children were expected to be polite, quiet, and obedient at all times, or else. If they misbehaved in public, it was a direct reflection of your parenting skills. So not only did you have to ensure that your home was a harmonious place, but you had to make sure that your family members performed perfectly, or risk public shame. And then there were the in-laws. Oh, the in-laws. The Victorians had very specific expectations of family gatherings, and the dynamic of dealing with extended family was a constant challenge. Imagine hosting a family dinner where you had to make sure that your own immediate family, as well as your in-laws, behaved according to the highest moral standards. You couldn't just invite relatives over for a casual meal. There were rules. Everything from the seating arrangements to the manner in which you spoke had to be carefully considered. There was no room for awkward silences or inappropriate laughter. Small talk had to be exactly that. Small, polite, and completely void of any real emotional connection. One misstep in the conversation, and you could find yourself branded as an unworthy host. Of course, there were also the unspoken tensions between generations. The older Victorian generation had strong ideas about how the younger generation should behave, and if you were the younger member of the family, you had to navigate these expectations with grace. You might find yourself at odds with your parents' expectations, but good luck attempting to express yourself without causing a family crisis. If you wanted to rebel or seek any kind of modernity, you were forced to do it quietly, behind closed doors, because if you dared to disrupt the perfect family order, you were a disgrace. The pressure to create the ideal Victorian family home wasn't just a personal one, it was a public affair. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances were always watching, and any perceived failure in maintaining the perfect home could have serious social consequences. The New Year's resolution to be the perfect parent, spouse, or family member was not only about making personal changes, it was about making sure the entire household operated like a well-oiled machine. The mere act of making resolutions for your family meant you were constantly under a microscope, trying to control every aspect of your family's behavior and image, and the results: exhaustion, frustration, and an overwhelming sense of inadequacy when things inevitably didn't go according to plan. Now let's not forget about the servants. A Victorian household wasn't truly complete without a full staff of domestic workers, maids, butlers, cooks, and nannies. Maintaining order in the household also meant making sure that everyone working for you adhered to the same strict moral and social expectations. The servants had their own set of resolutions too, which involved maintaining a level of decorum that was often impossible to uphold. What's worse, servants were expected to maintain the appearance of invisible professionalism, quietly attending to their duties without ever drawing attention to themselves or, heaven forbid, engaging in personal matters. But of course, with such rigid expectations came inevitable human error. The butler might spill wine on the upholstery, or the maid might accidentally place the wrong spoon on the table, and when these mistakes happened, it reflected poorly on the entire household, no matter how hard you tried to keep everything in order. As we move into the modern era, we might find ourselves shaking our heads at the Victorians' obsessive drive for family perfection. But the fact is, their way of life shaped how families today approach household management, perhaps without the same intensity, but with a clear focus on maintaining harmony and social respectability. The Victorians were deeply invested in the idea that a family's success was measured by its public image, and that any failure to adhere to the rules could have far-reaching consequences. So the next time you're wrestling with your own New Year's resolutions, whether it's about fitness, career, or even family, consider the Victorians and their dedication to perfection. Maybe we can learn from them, but perhaps we can also learn to let go of the pressure to live up to an impossible standard. Because, as history shows, trying to turn your family into a flawless machine of polite behavior rarely ends in happiness or success. Victorians had a very specific idea of adventure, involving expensive trips to the Scottish Highlands or long hikes in the countryside. Did anyone actually enjoy these adventures, or was it all about showing off for the neighbors? The truth is, the Victorian idea of adventure wasn't so much about exploration or thrill-seeking. It was more about creating an image. It was about proving that you could afford to leave your luxurious home, venture into the wilds, and return with stories of your bravery and self-sufficiency. But the reality of these trips wasn't nearly as glamorous as the Victorians would have you believe. The landscape was often far harsher than it seemed, and the adventures were often more about enduring discomfort than experiencing genuine excitement. And yet, these excursions became a symbol of social status. If you could survive the rugged terrain, you proved you were both wealthy and resilient. Let's start with the Victorians' favorite adventure destination, the Scottish Highlands. The Victorians had an intense romanticized view of the Scottish countryside. In their eyes, the Highlands represented both the sublime beauty of nature and the idealized notion of self-reliance. It was the perfect location for a grand adventure that could be added to your social resume. The beauty of the heather-covered hills, the rugged mountains, and the untouched landscapes was something to be seen and boasted about. But let's be clear, Victorian adventure wasn't about hiking in the casual sense. There were no comfortable boots, no lightweight gear. Victorian adventurers, who wore heavy wool coats and long skirts or stiff trousers, would embark on long, grueling treks that often involved navigating steep, slippery paths in inclement weather. These adventures were filled with suffering, sore feet, wind-burned skin, and the constant discomfort of trudging through difficult terrain. And for what? To get to the next picturesque spot that would give you the perfect photo op for showing off your courage when you got back to London or Edinburgh. But this wasn't just about the beauty of the landscape. The Scottish Highlands were seen as a place where you could test your physical endurance, your ability to survive without the luxuries of urban life. Did anyone really enjoy being out in the wilderness, fighting off exhaustion, dealing with unpredictable weather, and avoiding dangerous animals or treacherous terrain? Probably not. But the sense of pride when you could say, "Oh, I've just returned from the Highlands," was undeniable. It was all about proving to the world and to your neighbors that you were tough enough, cultured enough, and wealthy enough to endure such a challenge. But it wasn't just the British countryside that attracted Victorians with a thirst for adventure. The British Empire spanned vast areas, and many Victorians took trips to exotic locales, especially in Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. They didn't exactly set out on these journeys to explore new cultures or learn new things. Instead, it was often more about claiming new territory for themselves. The Victorian ideal of exploration often involved dangerous pursuits, like hunting large animals in Africa or conquering the jungles of India, armed with little more than their Victorian stiff upper lip attitude and some rather impractical gear. These expeditions were about gathering impressive souvenirs, telling awe-inspiring tales, and gaining status. The fact that they often came home with diseases like malaria or dysentery seemed to add to the heroic aura of the adventure. Surviving a journey filled with illness and hardship meant that you could wear your suffering as a badge of honor. These so-called adventures weren't about having a good time. They were about enduring hardship and showing the world that you could overcome it. If you went to Africa to hunt a lion, you weren't doing it for fun. You were doing it to show your peers that you were tough enough to do so. Even the trips to India, where Victorians would often endure heat, uncomfortable travel, and the constant risk of illness, were less about the beauty of the place and more about bringing back stories and items that showed you had experienced something exotic. It was about impressing others with your ability to brave foreign lands and face peril head-on, regardless of the toll it took on your body. But the reality of these Victorian adventures was far less romantic than the tales of heroic explorers suggested. For every Victorian who set out to climb a mountain or explore an untamed land, there were countless others who returned with debilitating illnesses or suffered permanent injury. The brutal conditions of travel meant that many Victorians didn't have the stamina to truly enjoy their adventures. They just had the endurance to complete them. You might return from a month in Africa with a collection of trophies, but you'd also bring back malaria, which might have you bedridden for weeks. Or, if you were particularly unlucky, you'd catch dysentery, which would ruin your adventure and leave you spending more time with a physician than reliving the excitement of the journey. In the end, these Victorian adventures weren't about having fun or relaxing in a beautiful location. They were about conquering hardships, proving that you could endure more than the average person, and gaining respect from your peers. The Victorians were obsessed with self-discipline, suffering, and endurance as a way to show their worth, even if it came at the expense of true enjoyment. If anything, their concept of adventure seems to have been built on the idea that hardship was virtuous and pleasure was for the weak. So while modern adventure seekers may look to travel for experiences and relaxation, the Victorians were more likely to set out with one goal in mind: to prove they could endure anything, no matter how much it made them suffer. And if they could make it back alive, they could proudly claim their status as a true adventurer. In a time when meat was a symbol of wealth and status, making a resolution to eat less meat wasn't exactly a hit. But that didn't stop people from trying to be more health conscious, even though they were simultaneously burning their dinner over an open flame. The idea of reducing meat consumption in the Victorian era was in many ways an absurdity. Meat was not just a food, it was a statement. A hearty steak or a roast chicken was the hallmark of a refined and prosperous household. For the middle and upper classes, meals without meat were seen as incomplete, even pitiful. To suggest that one should eat less meat was practically blasphemous in a society that prided itself on abundance and opulence. Yet despite the social and cultural significance of meat, there were a handful of Victorians who made the attempt to embrace the so-called healthier way of life by reducing their meat intake. These early forays into vegetarianism, while largely unsuccessful, are fascinating in their contradictions. You see, even though meat was the ultimate symbol of affluence, it was also a source of health concerns. Victorian medicine, though far from modern in its understanding of nutrition, began to acknowledge the potential benefits of plant-based diets, particularly as the Industrial Revolution shifted the focus toward more sedentary lives. As a result, some Victorians began to entertain the idea of eating less meat, convinced it might improve digestion, prevent illness, or even help with weight loss. But just because people thought it might be good for them didn't mean they were willing to actually give it a try. The problem was, meat wasn't just food, it was a symbol of prosperity, and avoiding it made you seem impoverished. In a society where appearances were everything, giving up meat wasn't seen as a health decision, it was a social faux pas. No one wanted to be seen as that person at dinner, the one who turned their nose up at a rich, meaty dish and opted for a pile of greens instead. So despite health arguments, the eat less meat fad simply couldn't gain traction. In fact, the very notion of a healthier diet in the Victorian world was tied more to how you prepared the meat, rather than whether you ate it at all. Boiling, roasting, and stewing were common cooking methods, but the problem was that meat was often cooked to the point of being dried out, charred, or overcooked, hardly a health-conscious approach to eating. The Victorians certainly didn't have the luxury of understanding the importance of low-fat cooking or avoiding the excess fats that came from overcooking meat, but that didn't stop them from trying. They might have resolved to eat less meat, but when it came time to face a hearty roast or a well-prepared pie, all their good intentions seemed to vanish. There was also the class divide. While the wealthy indulged in multiple meat courses at dinner, the lower classes, those who could not afford regular access to meat, actually found themselves with a more plant-based diet, albeit out of necessity. For the poor, meat was a rare luxury, and their meals consisted mostly of vegetables, grains, and whatever scraps could be acquired. The idea of eating less meat didn't quite fit into their worldview because for many of them, they ate what they could afford. To choose a plant-based diet would have seemed like a distant, unattainable luxury. And then, of course, there was the fact that the Victorians loved their meat-heavy breakfasts. Picture this. You're sitting down to a meal that includes bacon, sausages, eggs, and fried bread. Hardly the picture of a light and health-conscious start to the day. While modern-day proponents of a balanced breakfast might opt for something like oatmeal or fruit, Victorians believed in hearty meals, and nothing said good health like a plate stacked with meat and eggs. You might be attempting to cut back on meat at lunch, but breakfast? Breakfast was sacred. So while some might have made half-heated resolutions to eat less meat, the reality of the Victorian diet was one of indulgence. Meat was too integral to their daily lives, their identities, and their social standing to give it up without a fight. Even the growing influence of early vegetarian movements, which advocated for plant-based diets in the name of health and moral purity, didn't make much of an impact. For the Victorian upper classes, adopting a vegetarian lifestyle was not a pursuit of health. It was a radical act that reeked of eccentricity. Vegetarianism was, for many, associated with a kind of social rebellion, often linked to fringe movements or religious sects that were considered too extreme for respectable society. No one was about to give up roast beef and lamb chops just to be different. By the end of the year, those Victorians who had resolved to eat less meat likely found themselves falling back into old habits. The temptation was too great, and the social pressures too high for a plant-based diet to ever take hold. Instead, they would continue to enjoy their meat-heavy meals, perhaps with a passing acknowledgement that vegetables, fruit, and grains had their place, but not on the main plate. The idea of eating less meat in the Victorian world was just another well-meaning but ultimately unsustainable resolution, one that couldn't withstand the cultural and culinary forces working against it. Today, as we consider our own resolutions to eat less meat or adopt plant-based diets, it's interesting to reflect on the Victorian struggle. Their intentions may have been admirable, but the reality was that meat was too entrenched in their lives to give up. And so, in the end, they carried on, enjoying the delicious, if often unhealthy, benefits of their culinary indulgences. The Victorians may not have succeeded in their quest to eat less meat, but they did succeed in one thing: perpetuating an ideal of consumption and excess that would last for generations. The Victorians had very specific social obligations, especially when it came to New Year's Eve. But did they enjoy it, or was it just another event to attend and feel slightly uncomfortable at? Would they have rather stayed home and read a book? Probably. Victorian New Year's parties weren't exactly the carefree celebrations we associate with today's festivities. Instead, they were steeped in formality, rigid social protocols, and let's face it, a fair amount of dread. These events were more about duty than fun. The Victorians, ever concerned with maintaining their status and reputation, treated New Year's Eve parties as a social necessity. It was the perfect time to show off your wealth, your etiquette, and your ability to endure hours of stiff conversation, all while navigating the awkwardness of being stuck in a room full of people you barely knew but were obligated to mingle with. The night would begin with the expectation of a grand entrance. You couldn't simply show up. You had to make a statement. After all, a New Year's party was as much about who you were seen with as it was about celebrating the end of one year and the start of another. The Victorians didn't believe in quiet, intimate gatherings. No, their parties were ostentatious affairs, full of people in their finest gowns and tailcoats, all mingling under chandeliers and sipping on punch. The host would greet you at the door with a formal handshake, and from there, the evening would unfold like a play, complete with rehearsed dialogue and staged performances. The Victorians were meticulous about the rules of decorum, and New Year's parties were no exception. If you were a woman, you couldn't just waltz into a room and start chatting with anyone. No, you had to wait for the right person to approach you, and you had to respond with the appropriate level of interest and intrigue. Men, on the other hand, had to navigate the intricacies of polite conversation, ensuring they never spoke too bluntly or too casually. Small talk was an art form, and the stakes were high. One wrong word could lead to whispers behind your back. Did you see how Lord Pembroke made such an awkward joke about the weather? Yes, quite unrefined for a man of his standing. And so, the Victorians would spend the evening trying to meet each other's expectations without ever truly expressing their own personalities. As the night wore on, the pressure of maintaining this perfect image would mount. Everyone was expected to look their best, but the real challenge was to appear effortlessly graceful while enduring hours of socializing. And the food was the final test. You couldn't just eat casually. You had to partake in the carefully curated menu, enjoying each course with the right amount of appreciation while never appearing overly indulgent. It wasn't about the pleasure of food. It was about fitting into a mild, maintaining your image of sophistication. Can you imagine trying to stay poised while you're stuffed to the brim with rich meats, sweet desserts, and endless glasses of champagne? The Victorians had mastered the art of appearing composed, even when their stomachs were protesting, their throats dry from too much wine, and their feet aching from standing for hours. The entertainment at these parties was similarly socially obligatory. No one was there for the joy of music, dancing, or games. They were simply part of the required ritual. The Victorians loved their formal dances, but let's be real, most of them probably would have preferred to stay at home with a good book or perhaps a cozy evening by the fire. But no, that would have been seen as a sign of bad form. So they danced, and they played games. But was anyone really enjoying it? Probably not. Most likely they were counting down the minutes until they could politely excuse themselves and retreat to their more comfortable, private lives. The idea of fun in Victorian New Year's parties was far removed from our current sense of carefree celebration. It was an exhausting, regimented performance that demanded social prowess but left little room for genuine enjoyment. And then there was the inevitable exchange of pleasantries as the evening wound down. As midnight approached, people would wish each other a Happy New Year in the most formal way possible, perhaps even sharing a kiss on the cheek, depending on the level of familiarity. The greeting wasn't about expressing genuine excitement about the future. It was just another ritual to check off the list, one more way to adhere to social expectations. After all, the Victorian era was not known for spontaneous displays of affection or enthusiasm. So at the end of the night, when the guests finally trickled out of the party and returned to their homes, they were likely left feeling something less than satisfaction. Perhaps it was a sense of accomplishment. After all, they had made it through another event without major social faux pas. Perhaps it was exhaustion, knowing they had just participated in a rigorous exercise of social performance. But was there joy? Was there real connection? Probably not. The Victorians had created a world where socializing wasn't about forming bonds or enjoying the company of others. It was about obligation, reputation, and control. In the end, the Victorian New Year's party wasn't about celebration. It was about maintaining appearances and fulfilling social duties. While the modern New Year's Eve party is seen as a chance to relax, let loose, and ring in the new year with fun and revelry, the Victorian party was a calculated, often tiresome affair designed to reinforce one's position in society. So as you toast to the new year in your own way, perhaps surrounded by close friends, dancing, and laughter, remember that, for the Victorians, the true challenge of a New Year's Eve party wasn't the fun, it was the endless effort to maintain the perfect social fade. As we wrap up our journey through the curious, chaotic, and often contradictory world of Victorian resolutions, it's easy to marvel at how far we've come. The Victorians may have had their own brand of ambition, always striving for perfection in work, love, health, and even how much meat they ate. But their quests for balance, refinement, and moral uprightness often left them exhausted, conflicted, and let's face it, a little frustrated. In their relentless pursuit of an ideal life, they set the bar high, but they also learned, perhaps the hard way, that sometimes the greatest resolutions are the ones that allow for imperfection and, dare I say, a bit of fun. So tonight, as you reflect on your own resolutions, whether it's to be more social, eat less meat, or find a little more balance in your life, take a moment to appreciate the comforts of modernity. After all, we no longer have to endure frostbite for a brisk walk in the Highlands, or suffer through dinner parties with 5-hour speeches. We can take a deep breath, put down the heavy formalities, and perhaps indulge in the simple pleasure of not having to be perfect. Because as much as the Victorians tried to force their resolutions into rigid molds, we can be thankful that today our resolutions come with a little more room to breathe and a lot less pressure. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find that being a little more flexible with ourselves is the most revolutionary resolution of all. So as you ease into your own version of the new year, consider this. The Victorians may have been obsessed with perfection, but they never quite mastered the art of enjoying life in the process. Here's to making resolutions that bring joy, not just obligation, and to embracing a little imperfection along the way. Good night, and may your new year be as fun as it is fulfilling. Okay, good night.